So now I would like to introduce my friend, Nancy Vona. Nancy is a mother, writer, beekeeper, and gardener living in Sudbury, and she's the owner of 3-dog apiary with hives of buckfast, sassafras, I hope I'm saying that right,
Saskatraz.
and thank you, and VSH honeybees. I always wanted to say VHS, but she's been beekeeping since 2011 and is currently studying for her final exams for Cornell University's Master Beekeeping certification. And Nancy loves all bees and all pollinators, and she's currently working on several picture books about honeybees and native bees, and a memoir too about beekeeping during the pandemic. So Nancy, if you're ready,
I'm ready.
I'm going to turn off my video and my thing, but very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally, for that great introduction. And thank you for inviting me to give a presentation too. So my talk is called A Year in the Life of a Beehive. I put my contact information on the left, and you can see there's a photo that my son Daniel took of a honeybee foraging for pollen. I'd like to just give a quick presentation overview. I want to talk about my background and experience. I'm going to go over what exactly a honeybee is, who inhabits the hive, and then the 4 seasons in a hive: spring, summer, fall, and winter. I'll conclude my talk by talking about how we can help pollinators, and also a little bit of acknowledgements. So there's a lot to cover, so let me get going. First, my background and experience. I've been a beekeeper for about 10 years. As Sally said, I'm currently keeping Saskatraz, buckfast, and varroa sensitive hygiene bees. I've always had a long-term interest in nature and insects. When I was a child, I studied ants and gypsy moths. For me, honeybees have been what I consider the gateway bug to other pollinators. My goals as a beekeeper have evolved. First, I focused on learning about beekeeping basics, inspections, treatments, and seasonal care. I educated myself about honeybees through Cornell's online master beekeeping program. And last year, I really focused a lot on honey production. Now I think my focus is shifting again to increasing awareness about pollinators, both native and non-native. And as Sally mentioned, I'm working on several picture books in progress. One is called What Will You Be?, about the roles of worker bees. Another one is called The Builder Bees, about how bees are such amazing builders. A third one is A Year in the Life of a Beehive, covering the seasons in a bee's life in bees in an apiary. And then finally, one book is on amazing native bees. As I mentioned before, my apiary is called 3-Dog Apiary, and I named it to honor my pack of dogs. You can see a photo of 3 of my dogs there. So Honey, the Spaniel, is on the left. CJ, the Jack Russell mix, is in the middle, and Clara is on the right. I actually worked with a graphic designer to create the dog silhouettes on the label for my Honey. Honey and Clara have passed, but we did add another dog, and I'd like to add a 3rd dog again someday. So I'd like to give some background about bees. What exactly is a honeybee? A honeybee is part of the class of insects. It has 6 legs, antenna, compound eyes, a head, thorax, and an abdomen. As an insect, it undergoes metamorphosis, 4 stages of development, from egg, larva, to pupa, to adult. And a honeybee is one of 20,000 species of bees. And in this photo, you can see several different insects, including a honeybee. So the upper left photo is a honeybee foraging. The upper right, obviously, is a butterfly. The lower left is a ladybug, and the lower right is a praying mantis. What is a honeybee not? I get a lot of questions from people who think they may have a honeybee in their wall or in their yard, and it turns out that it's not. So honeybees are different from wasps, flies, and they're different even from other bees. So some differences that you'll see with honeybees and other insects. So in color, honeybees are black and yellow. In size, they're compact and smaller. In shape, they are rounder. Their hair, they're usually fuzzy and hairy. They have a barbed stinger, so they can only sting once, and they will eat nectar and pollen. Whereas a wasp and a hornet, wasps are hairless, They have a long, elongated shape. They're larger than bees. They have what's called like a thread waist, and they can sting repeatedly because their stinger isn't barbed. They are often black, but some are black with yellow or black with white. And they can also eat other insects, but they do forage for nectar. Hornets are a type of wasp. So on this slide, you can see the upper left photo is of a bald-faced hornet. The upper right is actually a hornet's nest, so not a honeybee colony. The lower left photo is of a bumblebee, and the lower right photo is of a paper wasp. A little bit more about the western honeybee. The Latinate name is Apis mellifera. Apis is the genus for bee. Mellifera is the species name for honey bearing. The honeybees evolved from solitary wasps about 100 million years ago, amazingly around the time of the dinosaurs, and they were originally meat eating. Honeybees are not native to this country. They were transported to North America from Europe in 1622, and there are about 16 subspecies of western honeybee. I think honeybees are so cool because they're known as a superorganism, which is a complex social structure. The definition of a superorganism is a group of related social individuals working together to cooperate as one large organism. So honeybees work together, not really for the survival of each individual bee, but really for the good and survival of the entire colony. And again, in this slide, you can see a photo on the left of in the interior of one of my hives. And the photos on the right, there's the left photo on the right is of a termite's nest, and the photo on the right is obviously ants. And some, as I mentioned, some examples of superorganisms are ants, termites, honeybees, and believe it or not, a creature called the naked mole rat. Another interesting aspect about honeybees is that they are eusocial, which means truly social. So 90% of bee species are solitary, and the remaining 10% exhibit some sort of sociality. Honeybees are truly social though. So some characteristics of eusocial animals are that they have overlapping generations. So you'll find in a honeybee colony, several generations living in the hive at the same time. So the worker bees and drones and the queen bee are all different ages. They will do cooperative care for the young. So it's interesting because it's not common for many animal species to care for the young after birth. And it's also not common for animals to care for young other than their own, whereas honeybees will do both those things. And in the honeybee colony, there is work division according to caste. In other words, there's division of labor according to the castes in the hive. So the two castes of females in the hive are the queens, which are the egg layers, and the workers, and they do everything else. And again, honeybees are different from other types of bees in that they're in a community that has many generations and they survive the winter. As we know, honeybees are an important source of pollination for crops. So I just wanted to read this quote. Honeybees are responsible for the production of crops that comprise 1/3 of US agricultural production. So they're extremely important for us. You can see some of the many crops. So these are the major crops that honeybees are responsible for pollinating: alfalfa, avocado, almonds, apples, cherries, cranberries, blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, peaches, watermelons, cantaloupes, cucumber, and sunflowers. Now that I've given a little bit of background about the species in general, I'd like to talk about who inhabits the hive. So what comprises a honeybee family? As I mentioned before, there's 2 female castes. There's the queen, one queen in the hive, which is a female. There's workers, thousands of workers, which are also female. And then there are the drones, which are males. And those comprise about 15% of the total population in a hive. And again, a definition of a caste is an organism within a species that's the same gender, but has different roles in the hive and has a different physiology. So I hope you're all still with me. There's a lot of info here. So let's talk about the queen bee. There's usually only one queen bee in the hive. She's always female. She's larger. She has a cigar-shaped body. She does have a stinger, although she doesn't use it very often. She's usually the only egg layer in the hive. She has a lifespan of 2 to 5 years, and her metamorphosis takes about 16 days. So from egg to adult, it takes 16 days. When the queen lays an egg, she can choose the gender of that egg by choosing whether to fertilize the egg. And therefore, she's constantly laying eggs and she's constantly busy during certain seasons. During the winter, she will slow down her egg laying production. The interesting thing about the queen bee is that the diet that she receives as a baby bee, as a larva, will determine whether she's a queen or not. So unlike worker bees, the queen bee is fed a special diet called royal jelly, which is secreted by worker bees during her entire time as a larva. And she's also fed royal jelly during the rest of her adult life. So when the queen bee comes from an apiary, so when you get a package of bees with the queen bee in it, sometimes you'll see that her thorax is marked with a color that corresponds to what year she was born. And so in this photo on the left, you can see she's got a red mark on her thorax. And the upper right photo, you can see she doesn't have a mark, but you can kind of see her in the lower part of that photo, the long cigar shaped. And in the lower right photo too, you can see that she's marked. Let's talk about the worker bee. So the left photo is a forager worker bee on clover, and the right photo is just me holding a frame of newly drawn comb with worker bees on it. There are thousands of worker bees in the hive. There can be up to 30 to 50,000 bees at one time that are all worker bees. They're always female. They do all the work that keep the hive alive. So the queen bee keeps laying eggs so that there's constantly a worker bee population that's getting regenerated. The queen can't survive without the workers, and the workers can't survive without the queen. The worker bee has the smallest size body. She's got a barbed stinger like the queen. The worker bee is usually sterile, but she can lay unfertilized eggs if a queen is missing from the hive. Her lifespan during the summer and the spring is usually pretty short. It's about 6 weeks. She will live longer in the winter. Her metamorphosis takes about 21 days to transition from egg to adult. And she's fed royal jelly only the first 2 days of her life as a larva. And then she's fed something called bee bread. Again, I just want to emphasize this point. We talked about the superorganism aspect of the colony. It is so amazing and unusual to see daughters in a group of animals that will willingly stay at home to care for their younger siblings and not have babies of their own. So she's one of the few species where the female will care for and protect the offspring that's not hers. And this type of behavior is known as altruistic behavior. Worker bees do more than make honey. This photo shows a frame from a hive with some worker bees and some captive brood on the bottom of baby worker bees that are still developing. So most of the time, the job of worker bees in the hive are age dependent. In other words, the first 3 weeks of a worker bee's life are usually spent on indoor activities in work. The last 3 weeks of her life are spent on outdoor activities. But changes in weather and the seasons and the changing needs of the hive itself can affect what her job is as well. So some tasks that worker bees perform, which I just think it's so fascinating and amazing. Worker bees are house cleaners. So as soon as a worker bee emerges from her pupal state as an adult, she'll clean her own cell and the cells of those around her. She can be an undertaker. She'll remove dead bees from the hive. She's a nurse. She feeds the baby bees. She's also an incubator worker. So she'll keep the baby bees warm by vibrating her thorax. The same nurse bees will also attend to the queen bee. They'll be the queen's attendants. They feed the queen the royal jelly. They groom her and they spread her pheromones throughout the hive. Then there's also the builder bees. Builder bees have many tasks as well. They will construct hexagonal wax cells where the baby bees reside. They build something called burr comb, and they'll use something called propolis as a glue to seal the cracks in the hive and coat the interior of the hive. They build the cells while, of course, the honey and pollen are stored. Bees are also, the worker bees are also HVAC specialists. So I think it's amazing that they do thermal regulation throughout the hive. They'll heat the hive in the winter and they'll try to cool it off in the summer. And we know worker bees is making honey as well. They do make something called bee bread, which is used to feed baby bees and other bees too. They will cure and cap the honey. Worker bees are also guards. They will protect the hive from intruders at the entrance. And they're patrol bees. They inspect the entire interior of the hive for anything that's unusual, shouldn't be there. And of course, what we know worker bees as is the foragers, right? Like when we see them out collecting pollen or nectar. So outdoor tasks are completed by the oldest bees in the hive. Now let's talk about the final inhabitant of the hive, the drones. So as I mentioned before, there are fewer numbers of drones in the hive, usually about 15% of the population. They're smaller than the queen. They're larger than the workers. They're male. They actually don't have a stinger, so they can't sting you. They've got a stocky body. So the left photo shows a male drone in flight, and the right photo shows some drone pupa that have been capped. They have very large eyes, and that's so they can actually find queens to mate with. They can live for several months until they mate, and their metamorphosis takes 24 days from egg to adult. Because the drone is produced from an unfertilized egg, his genes are actually identical to that of the queen. He's responsible for carrying on the genes of the queen to other hives, and he dies after mating. So finally, I've given a lot of background about the inhabitants of the hive and what a honeybee is. We can discuss some of the seasons, the 4 seasons of a hive. Spring is a time of reproduction, and it's a time of a story of survival coming out of the winter, reproduction and rebuilding of the hive. Each bee, as I mentioned, in the hive has an essential role in the survival of the hive as a superorganism. So honeybees aren't endangered, but they're an important pollinator species, and like other pollinators, they really could use our support. This section of, in my talking about the different seasons of a hive, I'm really focusing on presenting information that's specific to the Northeast United States. So hives down south will face like different challenges, but they don't need protection from the cold winters, so their spring season might start much earlier. The photos in this slide, the photo on the left was taken last year in April, and that is just showing me using my smoker on one of my hives. And the photo on the right was taken slightly later, and it actually shows some of the bushes that bees can forage for in my yard, blueberry and raspberry bushes, and a small pond that I have in my yard as well for bees to get water from. And you can see a couple of the boxes of the hives too in my yard. So this section of my presentation in terms of discussing the seasons of beekeeping or in a hive is probably the longest of my presentation because there's so much that goes on in the spring, and also because some of these activities do continue throughout the seasons. So the key behaviors and characteristics of a hive in the spring are reproduction, resource collection, honey production, comb building, swarming, and mating flights. So let's talk about reproduction, the queens and the drones. So the left-hand photo shows a queen bee laying an egg in the cell. As I mentioned before, spring's a time of reproduction, both individually and as a superorganism. The queen will resume laying eggs starting in January to February, depending on the geographic location of the hive. So down south or in the western part of the country, the queen may never stop laying eggs. But in this part of the country, she usually takes a break in the winter. She can lay 1 egg in each cell in the hive, in the brood's nest. So the photo on the right is a close-up of each egg. At the height of the queen's reproductive cycle, she can lay as many as 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day. So she is very busy. She does not have an easy life. As she lays each egg, she decides whether or not to fertilize the egg. So fertilized eggs are female, and they have 2 sets of chromosome, diploid. Unfertilized eggs are male, and they have 1 set of chromosome, haploid. Another important behavior that happens in the spring is resource collection. So to feed the queen bees, the worker bees, the baby bees, and the drones, the hive needs resources. And it's interesting because we always think of bees in terms of harvesting honey, but the bees actually produce the honey for themselves and not for us. So some of the resources, nectar from the plants is used to produce honey. I'll be talking a little bit more about honey in the next slide. Pollen is collected from flowers. And I just wanted to read a quick quote about the process of pollination because I think it summarizes it so nicely. And it's from a book called Bees, an Identification and Native Plant Forage Guide. The quote is, as a bee forages on a flower for nectar or pollen, grains produced from the flower's anthers collect on the bee's branched hairs. For a flower, the process of pollination is initiated when a foraging bee moves pollen grains from one flower's anther to another flower's stigma of the same plant species, or in the case of self-compatible flowers, pollen from a flower to its own stigma. It's amazing that it's such a complex reproductive process. Another resource, well, again, pollen is one of the resources I'm discussing. It's a protein, mostly made of protein, and it's used to fuel reproduction. A forager honeybee will gather pollen and then kick it into something called pollen baskets on its hind legs and then return to the hive where it's packed into cells by the worker bees. So you can see the photo on the left is a little forager worker bee with a little pollen basket. Like bright yellow clumps of pollen are visible. Water is also another resource that's collected by foragers. It's used to dilute honey to feed the baby bees, to increase humidity in the hives in dry locations, and to cool the hive when the interior gets too hot. Honeydew is something I think is used to feed the bees themselves, and it's a sweet substance that's secreted by other insects that eat plant sap. So aphids secrete honeydew. And like tree sap from tree bark and plants called resins are also used to make, they're also considered a resource for the hive. Resins are used for something called propolis, which is like a gluey substance that's used to coat the interior of the hive and seal any cracks in the hive. So this is about resource collection. There's so much I could say about honey. I just want to share a few facts. How honey is made: a forager will bring back nectar, transfer it to the tongues of a house bee, who will then ingest that. Then she regurgitates it. During this process, an enzyme called sucrose is mixed in with the nectar. Then the worker bee stores the nectar substance in a cell. Evaporation reduces the water content of the nectar down to 18% water. And then that is what honey is. And then it's capped with a layer of wax. Honey can actually last indefinitely because of this high sugar content and because of the enzyme activity. I get asked all the time of whether honey cures allergies, and really it does not. There is no scientific evidence that honey cures allergies. However, honey does have some medicinal properties. Honey can be used to treat sore throat, cough, and cold. And there are studies that show that scientifically there's evidence to support that it does cure cough and cold. And there's also evidence to show that it can be used to cure and treat burns and skin issues. I just want to quickly talk about some spring blooms, major spring blooms that are beneficial for honeybees. Bees will forage for nectar and pollen in a radius of up to 5 miles. So it'd be like if you lived in South Sudbury and you had to walk to the Wayside Inn for dinner. That's what bees do. Some of the major sources for nectar and pollen in this area are willow, maple tree, black locust, apple, cherry, blueberry, blackberry, raspberry bushes. In the woodland, you can find skunk cabbage and wild mustard. And some perennial plants that are beneficial to bees are strawberry, clover, dandelions, and violets. And the NP stands for, N stands for nectar source and P stands for pollen source. And I believe violets have both those as well, nectar and pollen. So the Wayside Inn actually has many beneficial blooms for honeybees. And this is something interesting that I've found out recently, just by taking a walk around the inn and talking to the floral landscaper at the inn. So there are trees and shrubs at the inn that are beneficial. I've included the list there. And there are perennials, weeds, and woodland plants as well. So I'll just point out a couple of them really quickly. So skunk cabbage is at the inn. Something called dead nettle is at the Wayside Inn right in Longfellow's garden. Candy tuft is also at the inn in the garden, in Longfellow's garden. And honeysuckle plants are on the edges of the fields near Josephine's Pond. I want to discuss really briefly comb production, because that's another important activity that occurs in the spring. So when nectar is flowing and abundant, the bees will work to build new comb to make room for increased population and honey production. And bees, I mean, think of this, this is so neat. Bees are one of the few species that use substances secreted by their own bodies to build their homes. I mean, think about this. If you were building a house and you had to pull pieces of lumber or bricks out of your stomach to build it. So the bees will produce wax from wax glands located in their abdomen. They secrete the wax scales, and they use the scales to construct hexagonal cells that make up the comb. Worker bees can't produce the wax until they're between 12 to 18 days old. Two signs that are that the bees are making comb in the hive is that the bees will form a chain called a festoon when they're making the comb. And you can see a photo of the festoon on the left. Another sign is that you'll find white wax on top of the frames when you open the hives. Wax comb in the brood's nest is darker as it ages because of a lot of the debris that's in the brood nest. Honeycomb is usually much lighter. So this is a really interesting activity that happens in the spring too. I know I've discussed a little bit about how bees reproduce individually, the queen laying the eggs. But swarming refers to the fact that bees also reproduce as a superorganism. Swarming is when the colony divides itself. Certain conditions have to exist for swarming to occur. First of all, there has to be a honey flow, an abundance of nectar. Overcrowding, a lot of times when the colony doesn't have enough space to expand its population or store honey, it will swarm. And weather, sometimes it's weather dependent. Swarms may happen after the colony has been cooped up during the during a rainy period. So once a colony decides it's going to swarm, the worker bees will create special cells called queen cells. The queen in the hive, lays an egg in each one of these special cells. The workers then fill up on honey to take with them. And then half of the hive, along with the queen, will leave the hive in a frenzy of flying activity. So this photo is on the left is of my hives, and I think a swarm was actually occurring there. The photo on the right is the sky after a swarm has happened. When a swarm leaves the hive, it looks like a tornado, but surprisingly, the swarm is gentle because the bees are actually full of honey, and because they're in transition, they don't have a physical hive that they're guarding and protecting, so they're pretty mild-mannered. So I just wanted to show some photos. What a hive looks like what a swarm looks like once it's left the hive, but before it's decided on a new home. So again, you'll see a lot of posts on Facebook, or beekeepers get a lot of calls saying that they think they've seen a swarm, they found a swarm of bees, and you can tell what a swarm is because it will look like these photos, a big clump of honeybees. If you think you have a swarm in your yard, you're more than welcome to message me, text me, or find me on Facebook, or call another beekeeper or a local beekeeping organization. So one thing I wanted to mention really quickly, back to the swarm photos, is try to resist the urge to kill the swarm or to spray with pesticides, because it is gentle and it's just a colony of honeybees looking for a new home. I want to talk really quickly about how once a colony is swarmed, how does it decide where to permanently move the swarm to? So to make this decision, honeybees will use something called the waggle dance. After a hive is swarmed in that clump, but before they move to their permanent home, scout bees will go out from that clump and try to find a new place to move to. And then the scout bees come back and they do a series of straight runs and circular movements. And this is known as the waggle dance. This waggle dance communicates the new location of the hive that the scout bee is recommending to the other worker bees. If the other worker bees like what the scout bee is suggesting, they start to mimic her dance. So it's an amazing way of communication. in decision making. So imagine if your family unit decided to move to a different town. Imagine if one person in the family decided this, and the only way that person could tell the family was by doing a jazz routine to the rest of the family, just to communicate the location and distance. That's what honeybees do with the waggle dance. Certain other types of dances are used by foragers to communicate food resources as well. And when a honeybee is in the colony doing a food resource dance called a round dance, she'll perform the dances on a section of the colony called a dance floor. So there's a lot of anthropomorphic terms that are used to describe honeybees. So rehoming a swarm. The photo on the left is a beekeeper trying to rehome a swarm in a hive box. And the photo on the right is actually a successful rehoming of a swarm that happened in my yard, where I was able to get a group of bees from a branch and relocate them into my Langstroth colony. So even though bees might have an idea of where they want to move to, once a swarm is in a clump away from the hive, they can be rehomed into a man-made hive. The key is really making sure the queen's moved into the new hive. All right, I need to move this along. I want to really quickly talk about mating flights. The hive is swarmed. There's no queen in the remaining hive, the original hive. So, but remember, the queen's left behind some baby daughters, some cells with larvae of virgin queens. So the first queen to complete her metamorphosis from these cells will leave the cell, and she'll kill all the other queens and the rest of the queen cells with her stinger. She then will fly to something called a drone congregation area. And at that area, she'll mate with an average of 12 drones. During the mating process, after the mating process, the drone dies. The queen will go on only one series of mating flights in her entire life, and then she's done. She's done mating for the rest of her life. And then when she returns to the hive, she'll start laying eggs 2 to 4 days after her mating flight. All right, I spent a lot of time on spring, but that's really to give it a background that will extend through the rest of the seasons as well, because the behaviors and characteristics that I covered in the spring still occur throughout the other seasons. In other words, honeybees will still collect resources. Swarming can happen in the summer and even in the fall, although much less frequently. Comb building is one thing that does stop after the honey flow. You only see comb building in the spring. So in the summer, the colony is built up to its peak population of between 30 to 50,000 bees, 2 to 3 times the size of Sudbury's population in one container. In this section, I'm going to quickly go over some challenges to the hive, beneficial blooms, and some behaviors in the hive. So challenges to the hive. Even though summer is a fun season for us, it has a lot of challenges for bees. There's dearth, which refers to the decreased production of nectar and flowering plants. There's drought that occurs. Last summer, we had one of the worst droughts in many years. There are pests. Pests include skunks, raccoons, other honeybees, wasps, ants, and small hive beetles, varroa mites, which I'm going to talk about briefly, pesticides, and decline of open space. And again, here you can see really quickly, the photo on the left is to compare it to the photo that I showed of my apiary in the spring. This is a photo taken in the summertime when the blueberry and black raspberry bushes are in bloom. And they're really filled out. So varroa mites. Varroa destructor is the Latin name for the varroa mite, that it's a real pest for honeybees. Varroa mites, I think, are the biggest threat right now for honeybees. The first reports of varroa mites in beehives in the US were in 1986. It's a mite that's part of the arachnida family, so it's part of the tick and spider family. The varroa mite will hitch a ride onto an adult worker bee to enter the hive. It then lays eggs and honeybee larvae, and it will feed on the fat bodies of the honeybee, weakening the larvae. And the worst thing is that the varroa mite will spread so many diseases and viruses to the honeybee. I cannot do this talk without mentioning pesticides, and I'm going to try to go really quickly. Pesticides Pesticides is an umbrella term that's used to describe herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. So herbicides will kill weeds, fungicides kill fungus, and insecticides kill insects. So pesticides are detrimental to honeybees and other insects because they will not only kill the organism they're targeting, but they can also kill or harm other organisms. In particular, a type of insecticide known as a neonicotinoid is especially detrimental to honeybees. A neonic is a neurotoxicant that has chemicals similar to nicotine that results in impaired movement, memory, and death in honeybees. It's not detrimental to mammals. Neonics are used to kill like plant-boring insects and grubs, but I was surprised to find out that like neonics are also used as a flea and tick product in pets. It's used to kill bed bugs and termites and insects on crops. So in 2021, the Mass Pesticide Board Subcommittee did vote to prohibit the use of neonics from non-agricultural outdoor use by people who are not certified. So that's one encouraging fact that's happened recently. In thinking about like what to use in your garden, in your lawn, in your landscape, consider the chemicals that are in anything you're applying. So you can look for active ingredients on the label. And I will include this slide in the handout that I'm going to send out to the participants or the attendees. But you can see some of the different active ingredients that comprise neonicotinoids. Just briefly, some beneficial blooms in the summer are included on the slide. The photo on the right is actually a sunflower. It actually is, there are not honeybees on that flower. They're bumblebees, but I just love the photo so much that I included it. And here's a list of some of the many summer beneficial blooms that you'll find in this area. And I just really wanted to really quickly focus on some blooms that you'll find at the Wayside Inn. So sweet pepper bush is actually in a section of the inn that has a native perennial garden close to Josephine's Pond. Clover, catnip, holly, yarrow, mint, coneflower. And then later in the summer and into fall at the inn, you'll find goldenrod, aster, and sedum. Really quickly, some behaviors in the hive that I think are fascinating that happen in the summer. Honeybee pool parties. So honeybees are attracted to salt. They might be congregating on your neighbor's pool, especially if the neighbor has a saltwater pool. One solution can be providing a water source for your bees and adding pool salt to the source. So I actually have in my apiary a small pond, and I also have a water fountain and a bird bath that I provide for the bees. And on the photo on the right, you can actually see the little honeybees drinking from the bird bath. And another activity and behavior that you'll see in the hive, which I think is really kind of cool, is front porch parties, bearding on the hive. So bearding is just a way of cooling off the interior of the hive. When a hive gets too hot or humid in the summer, the bees will cluster outside the hive entrance. They form a beard at the outside bottom of the hive. So let's quickly go through the rest of the seasons. And I appreciate your patience in listening to me talk about the different behaviors throughout the seasons. Autumn is a time of second harvest and winter preparation. In the autumn, there's a second honey flow. So in some regions, there are a brief period of plants providing the second honey flow or nectar flow. People ask me when I can harvest honey, and usually it's in the spring, early summer, and then there's a diminishing of the nectar, as I mentioned earlier. And then in the later fall, there's another honey harvest. This actually results in a short second honey crop. And in this area, the asters and goldenrod are really responsible for the honey flow. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt 1 second to ask someone to let the dog in. Daniel? Could you let Bud in? What is blooming locally? So asters, goldenrod, tickseed, ironweed, Joe Pye weed, loosestrife, and sunflowers. In the fall, even with the second honey flow, there are some challenges in terms of the bees dealing with diminished resources and one frantic last push to store food for the long winter ahead. So something occurs called robbing, where forager worker bees from a stronger hive might be targeting a weaker hive the weaker hive that might actually have a lot of honey, but a smaller population of bees to defend that honey. So this is called robbing. And you can see robbing happening in this photo. There are bees covering the hive, and they're trying to get into any crack that they can get into. Other signs of robbing are bees fighting with each other, clumps of bees dropping to the ground, and dead bees on the ground. Another important thing to consider about what happens in a beehive in the fall is the bees are gearing up for winter. It's all about winter preparation. So drones, the male bees, will start to be evicted from the hive. So because drones don't forage for food, because they don't really do any useful tasks in the hive, they are a drain on resources in the hive. In this photo, you can actually see the drones being evicted from the hive. There is also decreased egg laying by the queen. So the population within the hive begins to decrease as the queen decreases her egg laying production. And foraging is reduced as the days get colder and nectar and pollen become scarce. So let's briefly talk about the winter. And bees are interesting, I think, for many reasons, but also because they are different from other insects in that they can survive the winter. They do survive the winter. They technically don't hibernate, but they can overwinter. Their heart rate doesn't slow down. They don't sleep. They form something, when the temperature drops below 50 degrees, they form something called a winter cluster. It's like a three-dimensional football shape that extends throughout one of the hive boxes. And they stop leaving the hive for foraging flights. This cluster has a warmer inner component and a cooler outer network of bees. And the bees will take turns moving between the inner and outer cluster. So this is a photo I took with my FLIR thermal camera. It's a little attachment I can use on my iPhone that will show like the cluster of a beehive in the winter. Earlier, I talked about how the tasks of a worker bee follow their age. So when bees are older, they will do the outdoor tasks. Now that all the bees are in the hive for most of the winter, the foragers that have survived the fall will basically stop foraging and they'll share in the indoor tasks. So that's really referring to, that's what I mean by winter bees and their work. And bees do something called cleansing flights as well. So bees don't like to poop in the hive. So on the warmer days, when the temperatures rise above 50 degrees, you can actually see them breaking the cluster and leaving the hive to take cleansing flights so that they can actually poop outside the hive. Some challenges that bees face in the winter, obviously predators, food is a significant challenge, and the weather. So challenges to the hive in terms of predators include bears, mice, and shrews. Bears obviously love honey, and before they hibernate, they've been known to break into hives all over the area. It's surprising how many hives I hear about in this area that have been destroyed by bears. Mice and shrews are another surprise predator that can get into a hive, and they can enjoy eating the bees, the honey, and just hibernating inside a hive. And so the photo on the right is a photo of one of my hives, and I think the little bright clump on the left part of that hive is a shrew that got into one of my hives. Diminishing food resources is also a challenge for the bees in the winter. So because of the necessity that bees are required to use the honey stores that they have to survive. Because of this, honey harvest really should be limited so that the bees have about 80 pounds of honey to draw from during the winter. Moisture and cold are also some significant challenges. While bees can keep the cluster warm, it's important to help protect the bees against cold air and moisture. So these two photos just show, the left photo shows a hive that's wrapped in tar paper, and you can see the bees breaking in the cluster by emerging because it was a warm day in January when that was taken. The photo on the right shows something called a quilt box that's actually used to draw moisture away from the upper entrance of the hive, because moisture can be a real detriment in the winter as well. And it can actually gather under the inner cover of a hive and freeze the bees. So, oops. I'd like to conclude this presentation in a few ways by asking and getting you to think about how we can help pollinators. So honeybees are only part of the story. Honeybees have a lot of attention in the news, but consider that I mentioned before, there are 20,000 species of bees worldwide, 4,000 native bee species in the US alone. Many of these native bees are dependent on a single flora to collect the nectar and pollen from. And some native bees are endangered and they need our help. So we can support pollinators by supporting the organizations that help them, and also to consider your landscape. So here's a list of some organizations that I support and have been beneficial to me in many ways, and they're also beneficial to pollinators and wildlife in the area. The Wayside Inn was an amazing resource during the pandemic, and I think encouraged people to get out into nature. It was one of the few places that was open during the early days of the pandemic. Sudbury Valley Trustees is an organization that does a lot of land stewardship, protecting open space. Mass Audubon Society provides education. They also do land acquisition as well. Native Plant Trust focuses on native plant restoration and research. Eastern Agricultural Society educates beekeepers and also researches the challenges. It researches the challenges to honeybees. Worcester County Beekeepers Association is one of my favorite beekeeping associations. They are so friendly and welcoming, and even if you decide not to become a beekeeper and you just want to find out about beekeeping, they'd be a great organization to join. It's such an inexpensive yearly membership fee. And pollinator.org is another organization, Pollinator Partnership, excuse me, is another organization that supports pollinators through research, education, and conservation. I've provided a list of ways that you can consider your landscape. I will just say the overarching theme of this slide is to consider your landscape. Think of increasing native plantings. Really think about your lawn. The lawn is beautiful, but it doesn't really do much for anybody. And it's a big drain on with the use of water to keep the lawn looking good, and also the use of fertilizers as well. Increase some patches of dirt in your yard, because that may be where a native bee could nest. As I mentioned before, talking a lot about pesticides, reconsider pesticides. At least ask yourself, is there a natural alternative? Consider using water resources, providing a bird bath, because pollinators will come to the bird bath as well. Build or buy a mason bee house, buy a bat house, buy honey and other products of the hive from local beekeepers. So Duck Soup actually sells several different, honey from several different apiaries in this area, including Sudbury bees. And I just want to thank you, first of all, for listening to this talk and being so attentive. I want to thank the Wayside Inn Foundation and Sally Hill for inviting me to give this presentation. So this slide shows some acknowledgements too. Some of the mentors I've had over the years: John Carney, Mike Carey, Katarina Wilkins. Places I've been able to have bee yards and have an apiary at Ken Vaughna's house, Caitlin Sheldon's house, Victor Sokowski at the Water's Edge Farm. I actually have a couple of beehives over at his place, and a few organizations that you can check out as well. And then I just provided a bibliography and further reading. And again, thank you so much. If you're still with me, I'm really grateful. And I really appreciate that you took time out of your beautiful day to listen in on this Zoom call. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Nancy. That was wonderful. And I just can't help thinking as you were talking just how much I've probably taken for granted the bees. I didn't realize they were so complex, and the whole structure of everything was so amazing and integral to the things we eat and everything. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We did have some very good questions, so I need to scroll up through the chat so that we can make sure that they get answered. And so let's see. The first one comes from Steve. How do global warming, seasonal changes, and climate change affect the lives and life cycles of bees in the beehive?
I don't know the answer to that, although I'm sure they do. I would think that because of the seasons lengthening, and again, I'm not sure of the answer, but I would think it would certainly affect the foraging of bees. It would affect the queen's egg laying cycle, right? And it would affect, well, one way I can just personally attest to how it affects the honeybees is that the rapid shifts in the rapid changes in temperature. So like, in other words, temperature extremes, weather extremes, can cause, it can be concerning for honeybees, because when I was talking about the winter and the honeybees having, like, forming a cluster, a winter cluster, and not breaking that cluster, erratic patterns in temperature can have the bees break the cluster, so that they will then get caught, like if they've broken the cluster and they're out swarming, you know, flying around, and then if it gets suddenly cold again, they'll die. So I think just the erratic nature of weather is concerning. But that's something I could research and get back to you about too.
Terrific. The next question, you did address water and providing water, but this question asks, what do you recommend for providing water without it becoming a mosquito breeding ground? Any
That's a
tips
really
on
good
that?
question.
Yeah.
I am not an entomologist, and I'm not a botanist, but I would recommend, just for my own use, I use something called dunkers. You can get them at Erickson's mill and grain store. You can also get them on Amazon. And I do think that's an insecticide that does only target mosquitoes. So if you have like a bird bath, you could put a dunker in there. But there are other ways too of dealing with it. It's simply like just cleaning it out every day. Because I do that with some of my bird baths. Like, I just make sure they're cleaned every day, and that way no mosquito larvae are forming.
Okay. So now we have a question about how does the queen decide which eggs to fertilize? If the fertilized eggs are female and the unfertilized are male, does the ratio of male to female hold for fertilization?
It does. It does. That's a really good question. So yeah, I think some of it is obviously seasonal. So you're going to have more drone laying in the spring and summer. The fall and winter, if she is laying at all, she's going to really focus on laying females. Some of it is the size of the hexagonal cells, the brood cells that are in the hive. So the drones, the places where the queen can lay worker eggs, the little cells are smaller. For laying the drone eggs, the cells are going to be slightly larger. But I do think basically the proportion tends to be about 15% are drones and the rest are worker bees. And I think that's how she makes the decision. But that's a really good question. I'm actually writing that one down because I think it's so cool.
Okay, and somebody says, I bought bee venom in Australia and it contains Manuka honey. Hopefully I pronounced that right. What is Manuka and what is it used for? And yeah, we'll ask that question first, and then different kinds of honey Nancy wants to know.
I do not know what Manuka honey is. I've heard of it. I know it's got amazing medicinal properties, although I hesitate to speculate on beneficial properties, medicinal properties of honey without any kind of scientific evidence. So I'll just leave that there. Yeah. And what was the other question? Different types of honey?
It was, can you name some of the different kinds of honey out there?
I know there's wildflower honey, there's clover honey. Some honey obviously is organized, or like it's labeled because of the harvest, like where the bees are collecting the nectar from, the type of flowers. So I know two types are clover and wildflower honey. I feel like there's buckwheat honey and there's goldenrod honey. So some of it is dependent on the time of year, the season that the bees are collecting the honey from. And some of it again is dependent on what like flower they're foraging from.
Okay. All right. The next question is, did you say that all queens begin as workers and it's only what they eat that turns them into a queen? How is that decided? Which worker becomes a queen and how does their body develop differently?
I can't go into the details about how the body develops differently because it is quite complex. But remember I said that the workers will receive royal jelly only the first couple of days that they're a larva. The queen receives the royal jelly the entire time that she's a larva until the time that like her little queen cell is capped and she becomes a pupa. And again, the hive will only produce a queen bee when it's necessary. So in other words, when like there's swarming or when the population is growing so large that the hive as a superorganism needs to split, or when the individual or when the queen is missing. So if a queen dies, if she gets really old and she's not laying enough eggs, then the workers decide to replace her. And then they'll take a baby bee and start feeding it royal jelly. But the baby bee that's fed has to be a certain age. So it's like, it's kind of on the cusp between an egg and a larva. So it's like this 2 to 3 day period. And then that little baby bee will be fed the royal jelly and develop into a queen. That's a really good question, but it is a very complex decision-making process that is based on, is there a queen in the hive that is doing her job? And if not, that's when the worker bees go into action.
Interesting. So I know you were hesitant to get into the medicinal uses of bees, but when I was a teenager, I worked in a little town library, and the library director also happened to be a dairy farmer, and she would routinely have, aches and pains. And so she would go somewhere to get stung by the bees. And I just, I was a little afraid to ask her, but have you heard of this for arthritis?
And I don't want to speak to it again because I don't have knowledge of it, but it's certainly an area of research and interest, and it's called apitherapy. And there are actually like whole societies that focus on apitherapy and bee stings and bee venom. And that might have been what the Manuka honey reference or the question was about. But again, I will not talk about that because I don't have knowledge of it and I don't want to say anything inappropriate.
Okay, so I'll Google that after.
I think it's really good questions.
And then another question, again, scrolling through Facebook during the pandemic, I was starting to get advertisements, and maybe because I was talking about your program in bees, but for products where they sell the combs in jars, and you can actually eat the combs. Is that, you can eat the combs? I don't.
Yes, it's delicious. I mean, well, so you can do a couple of things. You could ingest the honey and the comb, the wax. You can chew it up and eat it. Or you could just take the comb and like use a knife and get that honey and spread it on crackers or whatever your choice of like bread or crackers or anything. But sure, yeah, the comb is edible. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, I don't see new questions. I see a lot of great comments. Thanking you for your work on this presentation. So does anyone have a last minute question that they want to ask? We will be sending out the video after it's edited and made presentable, so that you'll have that in case you missed anything or want to go back. And then Nancy, you mentioned the handout that you are creating or have created for to send out to attendees too. So you'll have that as a resource. So
I'm just looking through the comments too. Yeah. These are great questions.
Here we go.
Oh, someone wrote that she's getting her first newt this weekend. Marianne, congratulations. Yeah, I love it.
And we have a question. What kind of business is Three Dog Apiary? Honey sales or bee sales?
So Three Dog Apiary, I have focused on honey sales in the past. This year I am going back to basics, and I'm really just going to focus on strengthening my own bees and honeybee genetics. Sadly, I lost all but one of my hives last year, and I've never had such a bad like winter survival rate. And it was unfortunately to a very basic rookie mistake where I didn't put mouse guards on several of my beehives, and mice got in, either mice or shrews got into the hive, and they were decimated. So I'm focusing right now on like decreasing the size of my apiary and just making sure I build those bees up so that they can survive the winter. I'm loving these comments. Oh, how many hives did I have before the winter? I had about 6. Yeah. So yeah, it was an unfortunate loss, but I will say I've heard from so many other beekeepers that they've lost like 100% of their hives. It's dreadful. I think last year, the drought, the dearth, I mentioned the varroa mite. Varroa mites are really decimating the hives, and people have had so many problems with varroa mites, like just wiping out an entire, colony. Would I like to have more locations? Yes. Yeah, I would love to have more locations of beehives. I love beekeeping and I love to teach people about it. And if anyone here is a new beekeeper and you want someone to help you on your journey, I'm happy to help you.
Terrific.
Oh, and someone asked, if a queen lives only 2 years, does that mean a hive can only live 2 years? So that's a really good question. But no, consider that the hive, if they can replace the queen, if they recognize that she's not laying eggs the way she should be, either, the worker bees will then take one of the baby bee larvae that she's laid, and turn that into a queen bee. But also there are other ways. So that's the hive in and of itself solving the problem. If a hive is managed by a beekeeper, he or she can go in and then introduce a new queen, which I didn't even focus on the whole beekeeping aspect of honeybees because I feel like that's a different focus. Like this was more focused on the bees themselves and their life cycle and the seasons. But a well-managed hive, a beekeeper will recognize when when the queen is failing and hopefully jump in and replace the queen for that hive. Oh, does someone else have a question?
Yes. Are the chemicals of landscapers having much of an adverse effect on the life of bees?
So the short question, I would say, I think they are. The long answer to that question is, I think there's been so many studies about that. And because a honeybee colony is so well populated, that like even when chemicals do adversely affect an individual honeybee, there are so many bees in that colony that you don't really see like a huge decline in the population. But it certainly impacts the hive in a negative way because there might not be a significant decrease in the population size, but the bees that are affected by the chemicals may start to have like long-term health issues, even in their short lives. So like, remember I said that like you're gonna see impaired memory and movement and nerve damage in honeybees with certain chemicals. So neonicotinoids, which is I think the one I referred to the most, like the ones that treat the grubs. I don't know about landscaping, like the chemical fertilizers. I just know for me personally, I stay away from everything. I hesitate to name any kind of company. I don't want to give recommendations because I just want to be careful in what I'm recommending and I don't want to talk out of turn. But in any kind of product, you can easily look at the label. You can ask your landscaper what they're using on the lawn, and you can ask them, is there a natural alternative? If you're doing mosquito spraying, you can ask the company that's doing mosquito spraying, what are they using? Is it harmful to any kind of pollinator? And is there an alternative? Because I do know that like even with the mosquito spray, there's one that's like a eucalyptus spray that is actually quite effective, I think it's a good question.
And then Heather pointed out that the beverage mead is made of honey. And so, so we may do a follow-up program that talks about mead because at the Russell's Farmers Market, there were a couple of booths with mead.
Yeah.
So stay tuned if you're interested in trying that.
I would love to make mead. You have to get like a little, so there's alcoholic and non-alcoholic mead, and there's 2 ways of making it. That's all I know. But I think you need like special equipment, almost like when you're making beer, you need the special equipment. But yeah, I'm hoping to make some mead this year. But you do need quite a bit of honey to make it as well.
Okay. Well,
there's also beer that are infused with honey too, which that would be really fun to try to make.
Oh, I think we need to get trying.
The more I learn about bees, the more I realize how much I need to learn. Like there's so much more.
Well, you've given us so much to think about. We can't thank you enough for your time and for putting that together. It was,
Oh,
for
thank
someone
you.
like me who doesn't know anything about bees, I did learn quite a lot. So thank you for that. And
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I think we've gotten all the questions answered. But if anyone has more, please feel free to email me and I'll pass them along to Nancy. So just
Yeah.
once again, thank you so much for being part of this program, and have a wonderful evening, and stay tuned for more programming from the Wayside Inn Foundation.
Yeah, there's one this Saturday, right, Sally? I think there's another
Oh,
program
alas,
happening this
that
Saturday.
has
Yeah.
been canceled.
Oh no. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we had to cancel it. But
sorry to
we
hear
have some more, and we have some children's programming coming up
right.
this summer as well. So follow us on social media and watch our website, wayside.org, and you'll get all the information you ever wanted to know.
Thank you so much for listening, everybody. Thank you, Sally. Thank you to the Wayside Inn Foundation.
Thank you, Nancy.